Hello everyone, this is Mel here, Sneakers Corner. So today I'm doing a video where I'm just talking through how I got to where I am in terms of research, etc. It's been a very busy 3 years. February 2018 is when I started, so it's about 3 years and a bit. So I suppose people coming to the channel might get the impression that this, whatever position I have now, was a position I came into it, and may assume that I came with some form of prejudice towards the subject. I'm surprised to hear people referring to me as a mythicist and stuff like that. And it might surprise some of you how much my opinion has changed in a few years. I've done the whole gamut. Now, some people would see that as a negative, but I literally have followed the evidence where it's led me, looking at an awful lot of material over the last number of years. And so a few days ago, I just kind of realized I really need to do a video where I just explain how I got to this point. And there's multiple ways I can do this. I can probably refer to some of the videos I made. I may not remember exactly what month in what year. I'll probably remember the year, certainly. Hopefully I'll be able to refer to that in order. I suppose one thing I should point out that since I've started my channel, I think I've deleted about 400 videos. I'm not one of these people who believe in polishing turds. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. So you're not going to get necessarily professional quality, but I see this as back of the envelope sort of investigations, and you can polish the thing later. That's my sort of view. There's no point polishing something that's just wrong. And if you start polishing something, you tend to get overly attached to it. So it's kind of like that. That's my approach, rightly or wrongly. That's the way I've approached things. I'm more interested in just getting to the bottom of it. Okay, so how did it all start? How did the channel begin, etc.? How do we get there? Well, as far as I can tell, I think it was back in 2014. I thought it was 2015, but I think it's probably 2014, if not 2013. But I'm going to say 2014. Unfortunately, I haven't anything written down to confirm that, and maybe at some stage in the future I will come across some notes somewhere that will say when it was exactly. But I'd seen a video by Jay Smith on YouTube, and he mentioned that he was giving talks each week from the ladder in Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, London, hence the name Sneakers Corner, the name of the channel. Went along, met him after he'd been preaching from the ladder, and just complete fan of his, and ended up meeting up with him afterwards for a coffee, and met the gang, those from DCCI and others, and I used to meet up with them pretty regularly for about 3 years, so got to know them pretty well. They were, maybe I was one of the quieter ones, just hearing what they had to say and trying to take it all in, and pretty much sit in the back of the group and listen to what people had to say, very sheepishly, and gradually started to do my own research. And I came into this with the view that essentially the Islamic narrative is correct, and maybe there might be a few errors. That was my position coming into it. Okay, so that was, say, back in 2014. Around that year, I had decided that I needed to read a lot more books than I was. I realized that there was huge gaps in terms of my knowledge of literature in general. I had been interested in reading novels and stuff when I was a teenager, and then I just got bored of it and I stopped, and then I just realised, God, I haven't read this book, that book. And so I set myself a target to read about 50 or 60 books a year. And in that year, 2014, just looking at my notes here, that was the year I started reading Don Quixote by Cervantes. A very long book. I wouldn't like to say how long it is, but it's well over 1,000 pages, if not longer. Really tough book to read. And I'm mentioning this book, obviously it was written in Spain, and Spain had been under Islamic influence for centuries. But what was interesting is the style of it, which was that it was episodic. It wasn't written in a typical narrative form. And that's going to be important when I talk about the Hadiths later, because when I start reading the Hadiths, I notice it's the same sort of format. And obviously Don Quixote is a work of fiction, but I did see some definite parallels between the two, except for the fact that the Hadiths was pretty much humourless in comparison to Don Quixote. Then in January, February 2015, I read In the Shadow of the Sword by Tom Holland, and so obviously in the year before I had seen his TV documentary, which was quite a big deal. I think I also, if my memory serves me right, I think I may have seen Dan Gibson's documentary in that year as well, 2014, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was later, I'm not sure. But obviously I've been hearing about Dan Gibson's work at that time. So that was an interesting book. He did draw my attention to the wider historical context of that stage. And I suppose the big takeaway was the fact that so little was really known about Muhammad, and that everything had been written so late. And he kind of set it in the context of the Byzantines and the Persians. So that's as much as I remember at this stage. In 2016, so we haven't even started the channel at this stage. 2016, 2017, so towards the end of 2016, I read the book The People versus Muhammad. I also read in September of that year the Quran, so I read it all the way through. And I must admit, it was an assault on the senses. It was a terrible read. I don't mean that in any way than just being honest. It was really hard going. The tone of it was horrible. It was very repetitive. At least, I don't think it was just down to the translation. I think it was not a particularly well organized work. Very disorganized, a lot of repetition. Things started and then abruptly ended. It was very scrappy, and it definitely looked to me, even at that stage, like as if someone had thrown a bunch of notes up into the air and then just penned them down, and then whatever order they were in, they were written down. It was very messy. But I was intrigued, and I was trying to figure out what all this meant. Now, I assumed that, that Muhammad was the person who wrote the book. There was no sense of context, so it was very hard to make sense of it. But didn't have really much of a clue what it all meant, etc. It was also in 2016 I started to go through Sahih al-Bukhari, which was an incredible ordeal to read. I thought the Quran was the most boring read I've ever experienced. Now, I've read a lot of boring books, like I was reading 50, 60 books a year. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground, with just as a personal challenge, really. But Sahih al-Bukhari was a killer. It was 4,000 pages long, and an awful lot of repetitions, and the repetitions were purely just to suggest that these stories had emerged from someone's memory. But the thing that really struck me, even though I had read Don Quixote's book 2 years before, I could immediately see that all the hadiths had the same sort of fictional quality, except that Don Quixote's fiction was way better. The Sahih al-Bukhari's stories were just devoid of much detail. The point of repeating different people's accounts, if you can believe that this is the truth, that there were people memorizing these stories and passing them on, there wasn't much gained from all of the repetition, apart from the fact that clearly they were trying to suggest that these had come from different roots, so it's important to show the variations in the story, but there wasn't anything significant. And you could very well imagine that the same person could have written those stories with the variants just to prove that these had somehow come from a much earlier time. So I was suspicious. It didn't seem likely that this was really stories about the real world. It did have a Disney World fantasy mythology quality about them. Like, I'm sure you've all read some of these stories. It beggars credulity, really. You know, stories that are really gross, stories about, you know, Muhammad going to the toilet or having a pee, and basically how he cleaned his bum and stuff like that. And it's really kind of unnecessary and gross. And to think that someone like first of all, most of the stories were totally of no importance in terms of religion, but the idea that these were not written down and they were just passed orally from word of mouth for generations, you know, and people consider these worthwhile to remember, that they learned them off by heart, it was even then my first impression was, doesn't sound credible. So that was in 2016. It took till 2017 to finish that off. Now, later in 2017, I suppose one of the big challenges, if you like, to my assumptions about how Islam began was with the book Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, Britische Krone. And obviously it pointed out the fact that Mecca was untenable really as a place of trade in the early 7th century. Mecca had no chance of being a trade spot. It wasn't on any maps until the year 900 at the earliest, and even Petra struggled as a trading post. So that really kind of made me more certain that there's something up with the general narrative of Islam. Okay, so it's not just a small detail that trade wasn't possible in Mecca, or that you could support a large population in Mecca. It means that there are countless hadiths which suggest that all of this was true. If we throw out the fact that it's very unlikely that there was someone trading out of Mecca in the early part of the 7th century, then that destroys the credibility of the hadiths straight off. An awful lot of the stories depend on the idea of it happening in Mecca and that the person involved was a trader and so on. It's not really feasible for you just to say, well, it didn't happen in Mecca, but it happened in Petra, but all the rest is fine. You can't just do that. It means that these stories are false. You know, if they haven't been able to get key details like the location right, they can't just change that willy-nilly and the rest is perfect. It's more likely that the whole thing is a mountain of fiction rather than it based on anything true. So that was part of the sort of the gradual discovery in 2017. This is literally on the eve of starting the channel. 2017 was a year I also read the Bible from beginning to end. I suppose I had read the Quran the year before, and it was interesting. In contrast to the Quran, the Bible was actually a very pleasant read. I've obviously read many parts of the Bible prior to 2017, but to read it all the way through and to get a feeling for the overall narrative and what it was all about was actually an incredible experience. And definitely, whether you are a believer or not, it's definitely something you should put on your list of things to do. You do get a much more bigger perspective when you read it all the way through. Even if you don't understand every part of it, you get a sense of recurring themes and so on. 2018, I read a book by W.A. Clouston on Arabian poetry, which was supposedly written in Muhammad's time. But what I noticed about it was suspiciously anachronistic. And I later discovered that critics had suggested that these poems were in fact written much later and backdated, as it were, to Muhammad's time, because, literally everything up to do with Islam was fully fledged if you were to believe the fact that these poems were written at that time. So that was another red flag in 2018. Now, 2018 was the year that I started the channel, February 2018, and a lot of the videos that I initially were doing were basically just reflections on what was going on in Speaker's Corner. That was my main sort of interest initially, not knowing really all that much about the background to how Islam began. And I was more interested in the debates that people were having. And essentially, one side of the debate, there were Muslims who accepted that the Hadiths and the Sirah was true and the Quran had come from Allah. And then on the other side were people who didn't believe that Muhammad got a revelation, but still believed that the Hadiths were true and the Sirah was true. Okay, so this was the place I was at, and I, being part of that group for a number of years, I just assumed that must be the case. That was my assumption, that these stories are crazy, but it was a crazy place in a crazy land, and all these mad stories are historical. That was really still where I was at, even though Patricia Crona had raised my awareness of the improbabilities of Mecca as a place of trade. I assumed that it could be resolved by just moving everything to Petra. So that's, as far as I remember it, was where I was at. Now, 2018, I was also beginning really to kind of try and come up with an explanation for the origins of everything. And there was a couple of things that struck me. One was the fact that in the Quran, the word Isa was used. And, I've been in meetings where people were scratching their heads saying, oh, what's this thing about Isa? They got the name wrong. Now, as an Irish person, I'm familiar with the fact that Isa is the Irish word for Jesus. So I was immediately kind of struck by that. I was thinking, well, is there an Irish connection? And also the fact that, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was red-headed, and I was thinking, what if Muhammad was Irish? I know it's a crazy idea now, but so that was something in 2018 that I explored, and I looked at a book called Early Irish Monasticism, and I evaluated whether it would have been possible for Irish monks to have been in the Holy Land, and maybe one of them being the the person behind Muhammad. And I came up with some interesting ideas at the time. For example, there is an Irish surname, Quran, which sounds exactly like Quran, Curran, and there's an area in the southwest of Ireland which I had imagined could have been the location, because this is where that surname comes from. And then there was a document supposedly written by Muhammad which had a building on it, and I found a building in Ireland that looked exactly like the sketch, and I thought, oh, I think I'm onto something here. So that was my hypothesis, and foolishly I shared that hypothesis, but I thought it was onto something. But what I did then, once I thought I had a number of compelling reasons why maybe this person was really an Irish person, that was because he spoke with a foreign tongue according to the Quran. So I thought I was onto something. But then as I examined the evidence, I came to the conclusion that no, this is not only just far-fetched, really there's alternative explanations. So there may be alternative explanations for the red hair. For example, this could be because there are people in the Middle East who have red hair, and the white skin could be simply that he's Persian, and Isa is possibly because of another language root that the name Jesus took. So in as I discovered later, in Eastern Syriac, in Mandaic, you actually spell Isa or pronounce Isa in the way that you, as we find in the Quran, Isa, instead of Isu. So I eliminated that as a possibility. In 2018, I also read a book which was also very important, which was The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. That was useful in terms of discovering the telltale signs of myths. Typical mythical stories have very similar characteristics, and when you see those characteristics showing up in narratives, you can spot the myths straight off. And that was when I had a look at the Sirah, and I can't remember off the top of my head what year I looked at the Sirah. I think I'm going to say 2020 maybe, or maybe 2019. Can't remember when I first looked at it, but I've looked at it at different stages. It was pretty obvious when I did look at it that there were a lot of the mythological elements there. So it didn't strike me as remotely credible as a history. Now in 2018, I also read the book Hegelianism, The Making of the Islamic World. Another book by Patricia Crona. A hard read. I didn't necessarily accept the thesis overall, but I think Patricia was onto something there. But what really stood out was her use of early sources, in particular the Doctrina Jacobi, and this prophet armed with a sword, and the fact that it was one of the earliest sources we have on Muhammad, and was dated to 634, at least the event referred to, where there's an unnamed prophet supposedly alive in July of 634. That was a big turning point for me, because it was pretty obvious that the Islamic tradition is wrong about Muhammad dying in 632. Now, I've heard all the explanations at the time. They said, oh, well, maybe he had died, but the army was still referred to as the army of Muhammad now, or the Arabs of Muhammad. The other thing was the fact that Tayayi was in that text, and it was being translated by Robert Hoyland and others as simply Arabs. So that was another thing that I later discovered. But that was a big turning point, at least for the fact that we've now got something solid. we have a historical record of Muhammad. It's different from the mythology. So what's going on? This is the big question. What is going on? Is there a real person called Muhammad, or is it a work of fiction? If it's a work of fiction, then how can there be a contemporary reference to this person? Now, at that time, some people were suggesting that maybe Muhammad was a composite of a number of different people. Now, I freely admit, at that time, I was not convinced. I thought that sounded like a really complicated way of explaining what happened, and I was resistant to that. So I needed convincing. I wasn't willing to assume that at that stage. So what I assumed in 2018 was that there was a historical person. We have also Thomas the Presbyter, also from around the same time, the 630s. No, it was written down no later than 640, and this time it referred to the Tayyeh of Muhammad. So it refers to him by name. And initially, I assumed that Muhammad was a name and not a title. Now, something else that I read in 2018 was The Life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius. And the thing that struck me was the fact that his story of hanging out in a cave and being attacked by demons, etc., was very similar to the story of Muhammad in the cave. But what was really obvious is the fact that St. Anthony comes out way better than Muhammad in both versions. St. Anthony makes the demons frightened. He outsmarts them. He has perfect sanctity, or near perfect, and he is onto them. He anticipates what they are about to do. He understands them really well, and they're afraid of him. Whereas in contrast, Muhammad doesn't seem to know what's going on. He's visited by the angel Gabriel or Jibril. He's frightened. He attempts to commit suicide. He doesn't know what's happening. He has to ask his wife, Khadija, and so on. So I think in 2018 I was already kind of suspicious. I don't think I understood the concept of source criticism at this stage. I had read a book on historical criticism back in the 1990s, which is a long time ago, and it was just vaguely in the back of my mind. But the idea that you would look at a story and detect that it has borrowed from earlier sources, that was something new to me. But I certainly, without necessarily being able to put language on that, I was able to spot that there seems to be a very strong parallel there. And the life of St. Anthony was, I believe, written in I'm going to say the 4th century. I think it was either 4th or 5th century. So it's possible, very likely, that this story was very well known in the 7th century. If we were talking about two important saints, St. Anthony the Hermit in a cave, written by another saint, St. Athanasius, who was an opponent of Arianism. So I'd imagine that story was well known. And so back in 2018, I definitely felt that there were elements of the story of Muhammad that had been constructed using earlier stories. And that wasn't too bad, really. Over the course of 2018, I began to kind of question the narrative. I saw that the Arabian poetry was anachronistic. I'd scrubbed my idea that Muhammad was Irish, okay, so that went out. But I did recognise there was some historical origin to it, and yet there was, in terms of the biography, there was a mythological element. So it was very hard for me to explain exactly what I meant by saying Muhammad was both historical and yes, a myth. And people were saying, well, which is it? What I understood was there was some inspiration for the figure that was being written about in the Hadiths and the Sirah, but the biography, the Sirah, was mythological. That was the beginnings of it in 2018. And then further to that, in 2018, I read the Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran by Christopher Luxemburg, and that was a game changer. It wasn't perfect, I'm sure it made some mistakes, but he definitely made a very strong case for the fact that the Quran has got a Syriac dimension to it, whether it had originally been written in some form of Aramaic and then got reread into Arabic. Was it translated, or was the Razm originally in Syriac? I'm not 100% certain, but there were obviously an awful lot of borrowings of vocabulary, and so I think that was a good discovery for me. It made me question exactly what was going on in the Quran as well. I also read in 2018 the Exposition of the Orthodox Faith by John of Damascus, Sir St. John of Damascus. Obviously an important figure considering he also wrote about Muhammad. In 2018 I also read the Oral Formulaic Study of the Quran by Andrew Bannister. Now at that stage, I was still thinking maybe there was a historical figure, maybe his biography was different, and the idea that Andrew Bannister gave was that there was a guy who had absorbed the conventions of poetry, Arabic poetry, and was able to ad-lib the surahs, and these were later written down. That's essentially the gist of it, and I thought that was a good thesis. Later, when I further looked at it, I thought, well, I don't think I necessarily think it works entirely. I think there is a written dimension to all of this. It's not all down to the oral, even though there's an awful lot of repetition and there is definitely formulaic language there. It doesn't necessarily have to be oral for that to be the case. In December 2018, okay, so before we get into 2019, December 2018, I did an important interview with Dan Gibson. At that stage, I was fully bought into his thesis, even though I was beginning to question the veracity of the Hadiths and the Sirah. I wasn't fully aware that actually Dan kind of pretty much believes in a lot of it, apart from the fact that he relocates it in Petra. But at that stage, I wasn't particularly critical. I think quite a good interview up with him. 2019, then I read Christian Prince's book, Quran and Science, and that kind of showed up a lot of the errors that are there in the Quran. Very important pair of books that I read in 2019 that also kind of developed my thinking. In God's Path by Robert Hoyland and Did Muhammad Exist by Robert Spencer. These two books, I think, make a really important pair. In God's Path, Robert Hoyland kind of gives you the wider historical context. It gives you a lot of important details that really kind of expose the fact that, the Hadiths were being made up and that there are records of people saying, in the 8th century, saying essentially that these Hadiths are being made up, or that someone has been commissioned to write them and so on. So that furthered me down the path of thinking, well, the Hadiths are not historical, they're not reliable, at best they were an echo. Did Muhammad Exist by Robert Spencer was a fantastic book, still is a fantastic book. and he brings together an awful lot of additional information which exposes the fact that the Sirah and the Hadiths are not historically reliable, and that the earliest sources bring it all into question. And that's really when I start to get interested in the earliest sources. So if I'm throwing out the Hadiths and throwing out the Sirah, but I'm still accepting that there was someone behind it all that inspired it all, then you have to go to the earliest sources. And another book that was significant for me in 2019 along that pathway was The Death of a Prophet by Stephen Shoemaker. So in 2019 I did a series of videos going through various sources and trying to assess them and trying to figure out why there's so many contradictions between them. Trying to assess which one is correct, which one is wrong. How do we reconcile the fact that the dates don't match up? That was the problem. It's not just that the dates didn't match up with the Islamic tradition. The dates of the sources themselves didn't internally match up with each other. Now, in 2019, I was still of the opinion that there was a single figure that all of these were referring to. But, as we get to 2021, the fact that these sources contradict each other has led me to believe that actually those people who had said that it was a composite figure were probably right, and that's the reason why these sources don't match up so well. Now, 2020 was a fantastic year for a number of reasons. One of the reasons being that I discovered a book by Yehuda Nevo called Crossroads to Islam. And that really gave me an awful lot of material that led me to go further in questioning the story. The big one being that the rock inscriptions tell a story, and the story that it told was that really it wasn't until the 730s that there were popular inscriptions of Muhammad. So this is the thing I think a lot of people don't accept yet. If the Islamic tradition is true, apart from the fact that they've got the location wrong, so if Muhammad existed in Petra and in everything else is pretty much true, it doesn't work in terms of the rock inscriptions. The rock inscriptions do not suggest there was Islam there in the early part of the 7th century. There might have been a figure who called himself Muhammad. There might have been a war movement against the Byzantines and the Persians, but you don't see Islam there in the rock inscription. That's just the plain fact of the matter. And I think if you were to look through Yehuda Nevo's sources in the appendix, looking at all the rock inscriptions and they're dated, and his categorization of them, where he's able to point out, okay, these are rock inscriptions from the 7th century, and these are post 690, and these are the ones from the 730s onwards, and you can see a definite development where Muhammad comes out of nowhere in the 730s, introduced by Abdul al-Malik in the 690s. It took about 40 years before he became popularly known by the people, which is crazy. If Islam really began in the early part of the 7th century, it just doesn't work. Now, the big book as well that I should have mentioned, really, that I started reading in 2019, and then 2021 is when I finished it, because I was going through it at a snail's pace, which was Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, Robert Hoyland. That is a treasure trove of sources. It's got the best collection of sources in one place. So from 2019 to this year, I've been slowly going through every single source, line by line, trying to make sense of it all, and also picking up lots of marginal information that helped clarify a few things Sorry for the barking dog in the background. But in 2020, then the book that really stood out, apart from The Crossroads to Islam, was The Great Secret of Islam by Odin Lafontaine, a friend of the channel. And I think really he nailed it in terms of understanding what exactly the Quran is. And just for those of you who haven't looked into what his thesis is just yet, just a very brief outline of it would be that there were preachers in the early 7th century who were involved in translating a lectionary into Arabic. And my take on it was that what we're seeing is correspondence between the preachers, letters if you like, and you have junior preachers and senior preachers, and there's constant reassurances that this is a good copy, that this is a good translation in Arabic, and so on. That was revolutionary for me in terms of understanding the Quran. He also was able to give an alternative understanding of who the different groups were, like who were the Kuffar, who were the Nasari, and so on. I think he really nailed it. I'm very much of the opinion that is the best explanation that I've come across in terms of what exactly the Quran was. And even though the Quran has been edited over the centuries massively, you can still see very clearly its origins in that sect, which Odin referred to as the Judeo Nazarene sect. We also had Joe on the channel in 2020, and he referred to the group as Idumean Karaites. And as I said at the time, I didn't really mind which name we gave that group, but the essential thing being is that this was a group who had a particular project that is actually very different to what the later Islam became. Sorry about that. In 2021 then, I was reading The Excellence of the Arabs by Ibn Qutayba, and this has brought about a new sort of perspective, which is the idea that maybe the Persians were mocking the Arabs in their hadiths, because in this book he's defending the Arabs from the mockeries of the Persians, who basically present the Arabs as barbarians, as uncouth, who lacked civilization, and so on. And so it's obvious that the people who wrote the hadiths were people from Khorasan and also from other parts of Iran, but that was another nail in the coffin really for the hadiths, that that maybe not only are they fictional, but they actually are not even sincere in their fiction, their mockeries. So that brings us really up to 2021. As I said, in 2020, I just get this right. From 2019 onwards, I had been going through lots of different sources. Of course, should be pointed out that in 2018, I think it was. No, it's 2019 actually. I think it was 2019. Murad joined the channel, and obviously he brought a huge amount of expertise to the channel and introduced new ideas. We also had multiple engagements with Jay, who's also doing fantastic work on the historical critical method. Try to see if there's anything else I've missed out. Another aspect of all of this was the idea, as we were looking through different sources, and looking at the Quran in a new manner, we can to see that Muhammad in the Quran isn't referring to this prophet of the 7th century, but actually could be just simply referring to Jesus, just another name for Jesus. And Murad did a sterling job in showing how in different ayahs of the Quran, the same word Muhammad in another context could easily be referring to Jesus, because, for example, the same phraseology is used in terms of the Messiah whose mother is Mary and so on. So it's pretty clear that Muhammad could be used for Jesus in the Quran, so which undermines the idea that the Quran is connected to a prophet in the early part of the 7th century. We also in 2019 and 2020 we delved into all the different religious groups and how they may have influenced the beginnings of Islam. So we looked very significantly at Manichaeism, and we saw lots of parallels and lots of borrowing there. Bala obviously joined us, and he did some fantastic videos. One of them looking at how the Umayyads started Islam, and once we got more and more into looking at the beginnings of it all in terms of the Umayyads, it became more and more clear that we're talking about an origin of Islam that was way up north. The only thing is, was it in Petra or was it somewhere else? But increasingly, everything seemed to be pointing to Iraq, because Iraq was under the control of the Persians for quite some time. And then we have the figure of Iyas, who was suggested by A.J. Juice, who he refers to him, let me see, he refers to him simply as Elijah. He takes the Hebrew of his name rather than the Arabic. We saw how Al-Tabari's references to Iyas matched up nicely with the Chinese sources in 2020 and 2021, where we're getting more and more sources. I think it was in 2021, earlier on this year, we started to get translations of the Chinese sources, and that opened up a load of new avenues and became increasingly obvious, at least to me anyway, that there was a founder who was Iyas ibn Qabisa, but there was a niggling doubt in the back of my mind, which was, when did Iyas die? And there seems to be someone in the 630s who was being referred to by contemporary sources as Muhammad. Could Iyas have lived that long? The problem is, it didn't seem likely, and that was the thing. In the early weeks, I assumed that maybe he just managed to live longer, and there's nothing to say he couldn't have lasted. But Joe came up with an interesting idea that maybe it was Umar or Khalid, by an alternative version of the name, who was Muhammad. He was someone who converted to Christianity, took on an alternative name for Jesus, which is Muhammad. And that's the historical figure. So we have two sources of inspiration for Muhammad. We have the founder Muhammad, which is Iyas. Then we have the prophet armed with a sword Muhammad, which is Khalid. And I think, to Joe's credit, I think he's onto something there. It took 2 years to convince me that there was a composite Muhammad at work in the history. I'm sort of bought into it now. I think it's right. I think there's historical figures. There's also additional sources for the biography, which are from, for example, Ibn Ishaq borrows some motifs from the Gospels. We did a video on that. There are also other figures in the history that also seem to be an inspiration for Ibn Ishaq, and Murad did some video on that. So what else did we cover? We looked at the rock inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock, and when we looked at that in comparison to the wider rock inscriptions, I think it was pretty clear that it's really in the 690s that Islam, in its very beginning stages, was announced to the world. There doesn't seem to be any strong sign of Islam before the 690s. We have Muhammad in the Quran, okay, whenever that was written down. But that Muhammad in the Quran could be referring to Jesus, and even the coins that are from the early part of the 7th century that have Muhammad on them are accompanied by crosses, which again would reinforce the idea that it was Jesus that was being referred to. Now, in addition to that, we had Reasoned Answered came onto the channel, I think it was last year, and he did a look at the sources that the Quran borrows, and it's clear when we looked at that a lot of the allusions in the Quran were borrowed from Syriac sources, which again reinforced the idea that everything had happened way up north, not necessarily in Petra, but way up north. The 741 Chronicle, which is the earliest non-Islamic reference to Mecca, places Mecca somewhere between Ur and Kara. Now, there's two Islamic traditions on this one. When I first looked at this, the tradition that I was familiar with was one where modern day Shan Urfa in southern, or what would it be, southeastern Turkey, there's a local tradition that Abraham was from there. So that was one suggestion for Ur. But subsequently, we saw a source from a pilgrim that seems to suggest that actually, no, it wasn't there that people believed was Ur, but somewhere in Armenia. But in either case, if Mecca was between Ur and Kara, that would either put Mecca west of Kara, or which is alternatively referred to as Haran, so west of Haran, possibly northwest of Haran, or northeast of Haran. Either way, that 741 source would suggest that Mecca was not down in Hijaz or in Petra for that matter. So that would lead me to question the Petra thesis. It's not the final word on it, of course, and the question of the Kaaba versus Mecca are two separate issues. It's often grouped together, but perhaps the Kaaba was in one location, Mecca was viewed as another thing, and that they were later grouped together. That's a possibility. Now we also looked at the multiple meanings of Muhammad, one of them being temple. And what was interesting when we looked at the Alawites later in 2021, the Alawites in fact referred to Muhammad as the temple. So that's interesting. That just confirms really that Muhammad is a title rather than a name. So they themselves recognize that. That I found was interesting. The other thing that we discovered really this year from the Minshu sources, the Chinese sources called the Minshu, was that an early mosque that you'll find mentioned in the Quranic Geography by Dan Gibson, that's supposedly pointing to Petra. The evidence is really pointing to that not being a mosque at all in those early days. The internal evidence, I should say, strongly suggests that this was an Nestorian establishment, and that they are referring to Muhammad in that context as a deity that was born, which obviously would refer more likely to Jesus rather than Muhammad. And there's a reference to Barbe the Great, who was a Nestorian leader at that time. So I think that is pretty much solid evidence that at least one of the Qibla supposedly pointing to Petra is more likely pointing in the general direction of Iraq, and if it's pointing to Petra, it's purely a lucky coincidence. So I think that was one Qibla that definitely we should eliminate as being pointing to Petra. We also looked at the controversy around Eila, and I think that it's pretty solid that it's not pointing to Petra either, but seems to be pointing to Mount Sinai in the total opposite direction. Another interesting thing that we discovered this year was the fact that the Eucharist appears in some Islamic sects. So, for example, it occurs among the Alawites. It also occurs among the Yazidis. The Yazidis unusually have both baptism and circumcision. So that would suggest that Islam started out really as a syncretic religion. It wasn't in a purely pagan environment, but was strongly influenced by Judaism and Christianity.